The courtroom fell silent the moment he stepped through the doors, limping, blood seeping through his coat, snow still clinging to his boots like ash. In his hand, he held a tarnished badge, and he dropped it at the sheriff's feet like a curse. "This is the man who left me to die," he said, his voice cutting through the room sharper than any gavel. People turned pale. The accusations, the trial, the rumors, they all cracked like ice underfoot. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The wind in Briar Hollow didn't howl that night. It screamed. It screamed through dead cottonwoods along the ridge, tore shingles from roofs, sent smoke back down chimneys and prayers upward toward a God who might not be listening. Snow had already smothered the dirt roads into silence. What hadn't been covered was frozen solid. Wagon wheels hadn't moved for days, and horses stood in stalls like statues, steam rising from their flared nostrils in ghostly puffs. In her cabin on the edge of town, Abigail Holt listened to it all with the measured calm of someone who had long since learned the futility of fear. She sat in her wooden rocker, sewing by firelight. The lamp's oil was nearly gone, the wick burning low and tired. Her needle pierced the fabric with rhythmic precision. Her fingers knew the motion by heart. She wasn't mending out of necessity, not tonight. The hem she worked on was already sound. It was habit, survival. It kept the quiet at bay. Abigail was 33 years old, unmarried, childless, and, by Briar Hollow's measure, perilously independent. She lived alone in a house she'd built alongside her brother Caleb a decade ago. He was dead now, prison camp down in Georgia. Died of fever, they said. Or cowardice, depending on who you asked. Either way, he'd come home in a coffin, and Abigail hadn't stepped inside a church since. When the knock came, it was faint. 3 sharp raps, then nothing. Not the wind, not the beams creaking under snow weight. It was human, deliberate. Her pulse quickened, not with panic, but readiness. She moved slowly, setting the needle down, reaching for the rifle that leaned by the hearth. She didn't point it, just held it close as she stepped toward the door. Another knock, slower this time, then a groan. She opened it. He nearly fell into her arms. A man, tall but bent at the spine, staggering forward with the weight of exhaustion. His face was pale as ash, lips cracked, a fresh cut on his temple leaking a thin line of red that froze halfway down his cheek. His coat hung open, torn, flapping in the wind like a tattered flag, and it was blue. Union blue. Stained, dirty, but unmistakable. The fire in Abigail's chest burned hotter than the one in the hearth. That coat brought back too much. She saw Caleb in it, barefoot and grinning, the day he left. Saw him in that uniform the day she buried him, skin waxy from the embalmer's touch. But this wasn't Caleb. This was a stranger. One who would die if she shut the door. She didn't. With strength born of routine labor and grief-worn muscle, she caught the man beneath the arms and dragged him inside, kicking the door closed behind her. The rifle clattered to the floor as she lowered him gently onto the rug by the fire. His breath came in stuttered gasps. His hands were purple at the fingertips. She unwrapped his scarf and saw his neck was red with chafing, as though he'd worn the same piece of cloth for days, maybe weeks. His boots were soaked through, laces stiff with ice. She stripped them off with practiced hands. Beneath the wool socks, his feet were blistered, one toe blackened at the tip. She took water from the kettle, dampened a cloth, and began rubbing gently, slow circles, just enough to bring life back without cracking the skin. He stirred. "Easy," she said. "You're safe now." His eyes fluttered open, pale gray, clouded with pain. He stared at her like he didn't know whether she was real, or maybe he didn't believe kindness could wear a woman's face. You, he started, voice raw. He coughed, once, hard, then winced. Don't speak yet, she said. You'll tear something inside. She rose and fetched the small tin of salve she kept for burns and frostbite. She had little left, but she used it anyway, applied it to his cheeks, his hands, the worst of the frostbitten skin. When she reached his ribs, he flinched hard. Bullet wound? She asked quietly. He didn't answer, just nodded. She unbuttoned the coat further, revealing a crude, blood-soaked bandage. Abigail's mouth tightened. She fetched scissors and gently cut the fabric away. The wound was bad, not fresh, but never given the chance to heal. Someone had stitched it in a hurry, uneven and too shallow. Likely himself. Your lucky infection didn't take you, she muttered. She removed the dirty thread, one careful snip at a time, cleaned the gash with boiled water, and began restitching. She wasn't a doctor, but she'd seen enough hurt in this town to know the difference between pain that kills and pain that saves. He lay still the whole time, jaw clenched. Not a sound escaped him. She admired that, or pitied it. When she finished, she pulled a blanket over him and added 2 logs to the fire. He was asleep before she sat back down. Not peaceful sleep, but the kind born of collapse, full-body surrender. Abigail didn't sleep. She watched the snow fall through the tiny window, watched it bury the world outside. She thought of the town, its whispers, its judgment. If anyone found him here, it wouldn't matter what he had done or hadn't. The town had no patience for complexity. They believed in categories, good or bad, loyal or traitor, saved or damned. And women were never on the deciding end, but none of that mattered now. A man was half dead in her home, and he needed her. That was enough. In the early hours, he stirred again. She was still awake, rocking gently in her chair, the rifle once more within reach. Why? He rasped. She leaned forward. Why what? Why'd you help me? Her voice was steady. Because someone once helped me, and I didn't deserve it either. His eyes searched hers, like he was looking for a lie and couldn't find one. He nodded, slow, almost imperceptible. Then sleep took him again. Outside, the storm howled louder, snow twisting like ash in the wind. Inside, the fire crackled. One woman watched over one man. That was all. But in a town like Briar Hollow, it was enough to light a match beneath everything. Elijah Kane awoke 2 days after Abigail found him, drenched in sweat and half certain he was still dying. The fever had broken, but the wound in his side flared every time he moved. For long stretches, he stared at the ceiling beams, silent as stone, only his breath proving he hadn't slipped into death's quiet arms. He spoke little. When he did, his voice was hoarse, less from weakness than from disuse, as though speech had long since become a risk he couldn't afford. My name's Elijah, he rasped one morning, eyes fixed on the fire. Abigail simply nodded, folding clean linen with care. Names were sacred things. Given freely, they meant trust. She didn't pry. Trust was earned, not assumed. He said nothing more for a while, but the pieces came over time, scattered like bones in dry earth. He'd served in the war, same as Caleb. Unlike Caleb, he'd returned, only to find that peace had no place for him. Something had happened, something involving a badge and betrayal, though the details he left tangled. It wasn't hard to guess. Someone in power had turned, and Elijah had fled. The kind of story Abigail had heard before, only never in so many fragments. She didn't press him to explain. Her compassion had never required full accounting. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but in town, the chill took a different form. It began with a question, innocent enough. Orville Munn, the store clerk, scratched his jaw as Abigail handed him 2 bags of flour instead of 1. "Expecting company?" he asked with a sly half-smile. "No," she answered plainly. She didn't owe him more. Next came the pastor's wife, Alma Tate. Thin as bone and just as brittle, Alma saw a shadow flicker past Abigail's window late one evening while walking home from her weekly scripture circle. She clutched her shawl tighter and said nothing aloud. But in her heart, a verdict was already passed. By the next Sabbath, rumors had bloomed like fungus. In hushed corners of the general store, behind hymn books, on walks between frozen gates, they whispered, "She's harboring an outlaw. Heard he's not just a drifter. He killed a deputy down in Laramie. I seen her buying whiskey. That ain't for herself. She don't drink. Mark my words, he's hiding in her root cellar." The accusations grew not because they were believed, but because they felt right. Abigail had never belonged. She taught the children too harshly, some said, and yet too kindly, said others. She wore her hair down some days. She had once slapped a man in the saloon for spitting at her boots. Worst of all, she asked no one for permission. Not to speak, not to act, not even to grieve. The people of Briar Hollow didn't hate Elijah Kane. Not really. He was merely the shadow through which they could cast their judgment on Abigail Holt. Alma was the first to speak to her directly. She came in the afternoon, clutching a pie like a prop, standing on the front porch as if braving the elements for a noble cause. Abigail opened the door, eyes guarded. "I was just passing through," Alma lied. "Thought you might like some peach cobbler." "I don't eat sweets," Abigail replied. "But thank you." Alma didn't leave. She tilted her head, as if straining to listen for hidden sounds. "Everything all right out here?" she asked casually. "Fine." "No visitors?" "No." A silence hung, ugly and sharp-edged. Then Alma nodded stiffly and turned, the pie untouched in her gloved hands. Abigail watched her walk away, the wind tugging at her skirt like a scolding hand. Inside, Elijah stood just behind the curtain. He'd heard the whole thing. "She thinks she's got you figured," he muttered. Abigail's eyes narrowed. "She doesn't have the imagination." Later that night, Abigail gathered the kindling alone, chopping quietly beneath the moonlight. She didn't speak of the tension tightening around her, but Elijah could see it in the way her knuckles whitened on the axe handle. She moved with the precision of someone preparing for something. She didn't know what, but it was coming. Each day, he regained more strength. Each day, the town grew more ravenous in its suspicion. By week's end, the whispers had teeth. Sheriff Boone began making inquiries. Not formal, not yet. Just idle conversation with intent buried beneath the surface. He asked Alma what she'd seen. He asked Orville what she'd bought. He asked the children in the schoolyard if Miss Holt had seemed off. The replies weren't damning on their own, but stitched together, they became a shroud. And still no one knocked. No one said her name to her face. No one asked, "Is he hurt?" No one asked, "Does he need food or warmth or medicine?" No one wondered aloud if there might be mercy in her actions. It wasn't Elijah's history that haunted them. It was Abigail's defiance, her refusal to fold, her willingness to protect a stranger when every rule said she shouldn't. Because in Briar Hollow, a woman's worth was measured by silence, and Abigail Holt had never been silent. "She's acting like she's above judgment," Reverend Tate muttered to his wife one night. "No," Alma said, setting the table with trembling hands. "She's acting like she doesn't need it." And that, more than anything, made the town furious. The storm that raged outside had calmed, but inside Briar Hollow, a different storm gathered force. Quieter, but crueler. Built not of wind and snow, but suspicion and shame. They didn't want justice. They wanted to see her crawl, and she knew it. Every time she heard a footstep near the cabin, every time a horse lingered a little too long at the end of her path, she knew what was coming. But she didn't waver. She added an extra log to the fire. She handed Elijah a book from Caleb's shelf and said, "If you're going to stay, you might as well read." And when he looked at her with that quiet, haunted gratitude, the kind that came from years of betrayal, she said nothing, because what needed saying had already been said in her actions. She had chosen, and in that choice, she had declared herself beyond their reach. But Briar Hollow didn't forget, and it never forgave what it couldn't control. The knock this time wasn't timid. It came at sunrise, sharp, official, the kind that didn't wait for a reply. When Abigail opened the door, Sheriff Boone stood on her porch, one hand resting on the butt of his revolver, the other gripping a folded warrant like a preacher with scripture. Behind him loomed two deputies, eyes dull, expressions carved from stone. Boone had always carried himself like a man more concerned with performance than principle. He wore his badge polished and bright, the brim of his hat curved just so. His boots were oiled, his mustache trimmed, and his justice selective. He wasn't cruel out of necessity, but out of convenience. Abigail knew his type, the kind who kept peace not by upholding the law, but by making examples. "I need to see the man you're hiding," he said. She didn't flinch. The fire was already lit in her chest, stoked by days of whispers and glances that lingered too long. Elijah was gone. She'd woken him hours earlier, before the sun broke the ridge, and told him to go east, through the thickets. He'd argued, just once. She'd stared him down until he fell silent. He knew she wasn't asking. "He's not here," she said, steady. Boone studied her. He wasn't a smart man, but he was cunning. He sensed defiance like blood in the water. "I reckon we'll see about that." They searched the cabin, rough, graceless, overturning baskets, emptying drawers, peering beneath her bed as if the floorboards might confess. When they found nothing, Boone turned on his heel. "Miss Holt," he said, "you are under arrest for public indecency, obstruction of justice, and harboring a fugitive." He said it like a man reading off a list of groceries. She didn't protest, not out loud, but her silence wasn't surrender. It was contempt made flesh. They didn't cuff her. That would have made it too real. Instead, they marched her down Main Street with a slow, calculated pace. Doors opened. Curtains twitched. Children stared. Briar Hollow always loved a spectacle. The courtroom wasn't a courtroom in truth, just the converted back room of the town hall, lit by narrow windows and one flickering lamp. The floor was packed dirt, and the benches held the same people who had fed the rumors now waiting to see them confirmed. Boone stood tall, flanked by the Reverend, the mayor's wife, and a chorus of townsfolk hungry to be vindicated. The judge, an aging man with watery eyes and a spine worn thin from compromise, sat behind the desk. He didn't greet Abigail, didn't ask her version. He just called the first witness. Orville Munn took the stand, hat clutched to his chest like a mourner. He spoke of flour and salt, of how she bought more than one person needed. He mentioned a shadow he'd seen through the trees. He hinted, suggested, never accused. He didn't need to. The room filled in the gaps. Next came Alma Tate. She recounted the night she brought over a pie. "I never saw a man," she admitted, "but I felt it. That presence." Then the Reverend. "She's troubled," he said, voice low, eyes sweeping the room. "She refuses counsel, encourages the children to ask questions not fit for their age. She doesn't attend service, and now this." He let the weight of this linger, like ash settling after a fire. The mayor's wife followed. "She's unnatural," she said plainly. "A woman living alone, no suitors, no children. This isn't just about law, it's about decency." Each word wasn't a nail in a coffin, it was a stone on her chest. They didn't kill her with violence, but with consensus. They wanted her shamed, not silenced. Humbled, not heard. Abigail said nothing. Her silence was not submission. It was a shield. If she opened her mouth, it wouldn't be to defend herself. It would be to burn the place down. Then something shifted. From the back of the room came a sound. A soft sob, quickly stifled. A girl stood, hands trembling. Anna May, 8 years old, one of Abigail's brightest students. Her dress was too thin for the cold, and her face blotched with tears. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The room grew still. Then another child rose. Then another. All silent. All staring not at Boone or the judge, but at Abigail. Their teacher. Their protector. Their example. The dam didn't break. It didn't need to. Because at that moment, the door opened. Elijah Kane stepped inside, dragging behind him the air of winter and blood. His coat hung askew, one sleeve torn, the badge of another man clutched in his good hand. The room gasped as he limped forward. He didn't ask permission. He didn't give his name. He dropped the badge at Boone's feet with a thud that cracked the silence like thunder. "This is the man who left me to die," Elijah said, voice hoarse but unshakable. "I ran, but I ain't guilty. She saved me." Boone stepped back. The judge looked pale. What is this?" Elijah stared him down. "Proof." The badge bore the initials of a deputy long thought missing, a man tied to Boone's past, a man who had disappeared shortly after Elijah was declared a deserter. The courtroom changed in seconds. Faces that once looked smug now looked afraid. The Reverend averted his gaze. Alma's lips thinned to nothing. Boone said nothing. His mouth opened, but no sound came. The judge banged his gavel once. "Charges dismissed." Just like that, it was over. But it wasn't justice. Justice would have required reckoning. What they gave Abigail was release. She stood slowly, her back straight, her hands steady. She looked not at Boone, nor the judge, but at the crowd. Not with hatred, not with satisfaction, with clarity. And it made them uncomfortable. Because in that moment, they knew. She had never needed their permission. And now, they would never earn her forgiveness. Spring came slowly that year. It did not bloom. It crept. The thaw was reluctant, as though the earth itself feared being reborn after the harshness of winter. Briar Hollow lay under a leaden sky, the snow retreating inch by inch, the mud swallowing boots, the ice on the creek groaning with every sun-warmed afternoon before snapping like a tired promise. From the edge of town, a wagon rolled out one morning with the quiet finality of a closed door. The wood was old but strong. Elijah had rebuilt it with his own hands, plank by stubborn plank. It carried only what mattered: a few tools, a worn satchel, 2 books, 1 rifle, and the woman who no longer belonged. Abigail Holt didn't say goodbye. Not to the schoolhouse, though her initials were carved into the underside of the teacher's desk. Not to the children, though she had taught most of them how to read, and a few how to think. Not to the townspeople, because she knew their silence better than any farewell. She simply stepped onto the wagon's bench beside Elijah, her face unreadable, her shoulders squared to the road ahead. They didn't speak as they passed the church. The bell stood still. They didn't speak as they passed Orville's store. The sign creaked in the wind. They didn't need words. The message was in motion. We're done here. Behind lace curtains and glass panes, the town watched. No one waved. No one wept. But they watched. And that was new, because in Briar Hollow it was easy to talk, easier still to judge. But watching in silence, that was something different. It meant they knew. They knew what they had done, or failed to do. The courtroom was behind them now, but the echoes remained. Abigail had walked out cleared of charges but not cleansed. The truth had emerged, but no one had offered apology. No one had dared approach her after the trial. Not the judge, not the reverend, not even Alma Tate, whose hands had trembled as she arranged Sunday's altar lilies that week. Instead, they let Abigail leave. They let her walk away, as though she were a bad chapter in a book they no longer wished to finish. But books don't forget, and neither do children. The new teacher arrived the following week, a young woman from Cheyenne, polite and proper, hair pinned tightly, hands always folded. She didn't question curriculum. She avoided controversy. The parents smiled, said she was a breath of fresh air, but the children noticed the difference. She never asked them what they thought, only what they knew. She never read them Aesop or Whitman, never asked them to write their own endings to old stories. She didn't speak of right and wrong as tangled things. To her, everything was tidy, moral, and safe. And somehow, emptier. At church, Reverend Tate's sermons rang hollow. The same verses, the same cadences, but the eyes that once looked to him for moral certainty now glanced away. People still bowed their heads at prayer, but something in their posture had shifted, from reverence to discomfort. They had witnessed something that couldn't be unwitnessed. A woman thrown to wolves for showing mercy, and a man who bled his truth onto courtroom floors until the town was forced to look at itself. Boone was gone. He'd packed up within days of the trial, leaving behind a badge he no longer had the right to wear and a reputation too stained to repair. No one mentioned his name anymore, not because they'd forgotten him, because remembering him was too revealing. And so Briar Hollow did what it always did. It buried discomfort beneath routine. But winter would always return. When the first frost came the following November, when the windows clouded over and the air bit like guilt, so did the stories. They began in kitchens, over stew pots, in murmurs. She didn't even flinch when he called her a liar. They never proved he was guilty, just scared. I heard she gave her own food while he healed. Maybe we were wrong. We were. But they never said it loud. Shame doesn't shout. It whispers. It lives in silences between sentences. It curls beneath coats in cold churches. It stirs in the way a man looks away from his reflection when shaving in the morning. And the stories grew. Children repeated them on snow-covered porches. "That was my teacher," Anna May said, pointing to the road where Abigail once left. She wasn't afraid. The others nodded. They didn't speak of the trial. They didn't use words like fugitive or indecency. They said things like, she helped him, she told the truth, she left because they didn't deserve her. And so, year by year, Abigail Holt became something else. Not a scandal, not a savior. A memory with weight, something too solid to dismiss, too painful to idolize. They spoke of her not with guilt, but with shame. The kind of shame that doesn't ask for penance, but still lingers. That makes a man pause before mocking a woman who lives alone. That makes a preacher hesitate before condemning doubt. That makes a town think before it speaks. And in Briar Hollow, where thinking came late and pride came early, that was no small thing. In the stillness of January nights, with the wind howling through empty alleys and the cold creeping beneath doors, The silence said more than the hymns ever did. Not because justice had been done, not because redemption had been found, but because one woman's defiance had left a mark deeper than judgment ever could. Because the fire she lit wasn't for vengeance, it was for clarity, and the frost never quite covered it again.